media is the most important part here, so we'll give him a chance to set up. He just came from a meeting next door that went from 5 till 7, and we'll give Sean a moment to... I'm using the analog clock that I'm looking at, and it actually gives us another 35 seconds, but I noticed the digital one says 7:01, so we'll get ourselves started. And I just would indicate regrets. Councillor Mueller has been nursing a really damaged leg. He won't be here today. He was with us this afternoon, and he just doesn't want to sit through another session where his leg's bothering too much. He got hit in a soccer game, absolutely clean hit apparently, but he's suffering, and the other guy walked away, and he's on crutches. So.
And he was the biggest.
And yeah, and just so you know the full story, Noel is 6'2" and on the good side of 200 pounds, and the other guy was much lighter, but he walked away. So. No. Okay, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the regular meeting of Council for Wednesday, May 2nd, 2018. And I'd like to call this meeting to order. And as we usually do, also reference the conflict of interest provisions in the Community Charter. And if any of the Council members have a conflict with any of the material arising from any of the material that we're dealing with tonight, I would trust that you will declare at the appropriate time and recuse yourselves. We have an agenda that was circulated and then amended to include material that had inadvertently been left off. So the order paper doesn't change, but there is additional documentation for item 10.1, which changes all of the page numbering. So councillors all have the amended agenda. And if you, or you understand what the amended agenda is, and if you do, can I have a motion to thank you to adopt the agenda as amended? And Councillor Seegers moved and Councillor Lutz second. All those in favor? And that's carried, so we can start. This evening we have two delegations on the Strongman Group Ocean Villas Development Permit and the Seaview Villas Development Permit. And I'll start by calling the representative from, and I think that's a typo, but it's the Strongman Group. And Mr. Lightbody, if you don't mind, you'd come to the front here, and when you're prepared to speak, push the little button in front of you and I'll make sure it stays on.
Good evening. Is it working?
It's working.
Test, test.
And that is a good test. Can people at the back hear? Because we do have to adjust on that side of the room. Thank you.
Perfect. Good evening, Mayor, councillors, and staff. Thanks for hearing us tonight. As the Mayor mentioned, I'm here on behalf of MP Lightbody and Formline Architecture, representing our client, the Strongman Group, regarding an application that has been finding various routes through Seashelt over the last 2.5, 3 years, wherein we're looking to develop the property at 52520 McCourt. In the last, the reason I'm speaking primarily today is that in the last meeting here in this room, there were obviously some misinterpretations of a fair amount of the information that's been put forward for this application. And we felt it prudent to speak to that specifically. I know the planning department has a report that they'll present, but prior to that, it would be good to talk to some of that misunderstanding that's gone on. And just as a sideline, I live and do a lot of work on Bowen Island, and the process of interaction around developments like this is key in moving a project forward in a way that takes it to a place where it wouldn't have been if an applicant just simply came in and developed. And we've probably all seen that in other towns and cities where that does happen. So in that regard, I'd like to thank the West Sechelt Community Association for their detailed vigor in reviewing what we've been doing, because it has helped hone this into a better project. But there, like I mentioned, some misinterpretations that I'd like to point out. Do you have the screen with 9 images? Yeah, there's a PDF with images on it. There we go. So the first, I've got 9 points here, and if I can keep it to 1 minute or less for each of these, then we're making good time. There has been talk of us building on easements on the property, and quite simply, you know, we've actually since that dialogue gone into this and re-researched the fact that there aren't any. There is an easement in red that is on that occurs on the neighbors' properties in behind us, but currently there are no easements on the existing property. There will be, because we will be developing a relationship with the existing strata group where we have to deal with the existing services that have been put in for the entire site. But I'll speak to that on another point here in a second. So firstly, no easements. Secondly, there's been the perception that we have been modifying grade in order to achieve more height. The actual opposite is the case in that a lot of the earthwork that was undertaken on this site 3 or 4 years ago, or possibly when the first phase was built, has left lumps of land that we actually have to remove in order to get the roads low enough to come essentially at the same level as the existing roads for the first phase of Seaview Villas. So not only have we not been using grade to try and elevate height, but we've actually, it's in our way. So we have to remove that. Thirdly, with respect to height, there's been talk about the buildings being too tall for the site. In an effort to make our development fit as best as possible with the intent of the original phase 1 and the intent of the entire property, we've looked at how to access these units, how to deal with the roadways in a way that keeps them as low as possible. And the yellow area that you see in those images is the maximum height permitted. The buildings we're proposing are essentially from the back a story and a half, and from the front a 2-story. The garages are split level, so you enter halfway between those two. So height, we've been trying to keep this as low as possible. We're restricted slightly by the access. Any lower and we can't make that split level work. There's also been dialogue about the proximity between buildings, and please could you look at the development permit that was approved in 2004 and do your best to, you know, keep in line with that. We did, and when we went to this 2-story approach as opposed to our original 3-story, we wanted to make sure that we weren't any closer than those existing buildings, and we are not. You can see on the far left, 11'7", that is the distance between 2 of the existing buildings, and our buildings are a minimum of a foot bigger than that, and then up from there. Retaining systems. Unfortunately, because we're dealing with a fairly steep grade change for the bottom, skip back 1 shot if you would. The bottom 2 on the right, you can see where it says a bunch of stuff there, and there's an arrow pointing to that section. Those 2 buildings, there's a fair amount of grade change there, and in order for the access to work on the back, without the driveways constantly bringing water in, we've had to keep those elevated. And we have them at the same height in terms of the road access as is in the original 2006 development permit. Those roads are essentially at exactly the same height as was in that original approved DP. We do need, though, those 2 buildings, 2 tiers of alum block so we can maximize the amount of dirt we can fit in. I noticed the original plan was showing rocks, but you can't fit as much planting with rocks because the rocks take up a fair amount of room. Alum block being only 8 inches, we can fit more dirt. The worst case scenario, on the far right bottom corner, we've got 2 walls right on the corner that are approximately 4 feet high and separated by 4 feet. So there's room for planting in there at the bottom and at the top. Stormwater services. So that's image number 9. You can't make out the colors very well, but essentially what I wanted to, back up one more. Thank you. This is our civil engineering drawing, and it is 90% based on the civil engineering drawing that was done for the original application in 2006. In that, it shows a couple of areas where we need to modify the storm, the sanitary. We actually have to move the power a fair amount. That's our biggest issue. But everything else is in place in those locations, and we've managed to make the buildings fit around them so that we could keep those services in areas where they can stay, and therefore minimize trucking, minimize the cost of redeveloping it, et cetera, and minimize the amount of ground upheaval. There's also been point 8 here. There's been some potentially misinformation, but also just lag between evolution of the project. The eave sizes on the buildings, originally we wanted to put big eaves on them. My office, we're a fan of big eaves for protection, for walking outside in the rain, et cetera, et cetera. There were issues with that, so we've reduced the eaves, and this was done quite some time ago, to 2 feet, except over the entries where it extends out over a landing and a stairway to cover people using that area from the rain. So just to clear up eave sizes, it's only in those red areas that we're extending beyond the 2 feet. The last point I've got here, where there seems to have been some misinterpretation, relates to the exterior stairs. There is a requirement, which I had never seen before in any other jurisdiction, that there be no exterior stairs, essentially. The intent that I took from that was that that couldn't be your only means of egress. And therefore, when we developed the scheme, we had the primary use is the interior stair from the garage, the exterior stair being the front door, if you will, so that it is evidently the front door. It animates those elevations. It creates more interest to those areas. And obviously, if someone's coming to the front door, they have about 7 steps to go up because it's just a half level. It also permitted us the ability for the lower units to have a virtually at-grade front door. So half of these units, you essentially could roll right in. So that hopefully clears up the exterior stair. Like I say, the exteriors of the buildings we see as benefited aesthetically by this addition. In closing, I'd just like to again speak to the people who have had opposition and criticism and put forward very valid notes on what we're doing. There has been a lot of evolution over these last 3 years, and it's led to a place where we feel that we've come up with something that suits a lot of what people are looking for up here now. And we look favorably on your response to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll just see if there's any questions from council before you leave. And
sure.
I see one hand, Councillor Inkster.
So, Mike, there's as you've heard, and as you know from the work you're doing with the Strongman Group, there's a number of concerns that have been addressed to yourself and addressed to council on this development. I would ask you one question, and then I'll ask a second question after Councillor Seegers, perhaps. Have you met with those with concerns and/or the community group and/or the association discuss those concerns? And do you believe that you've met a number of those concerns with, as best you can, solutions as you met with the groups to determine what they have concerns with and what you can actually do as part of the development to meet those issues?
Our first meeting was with the existing strata, and we proceeded to meet with them quite a number of times to hopefully stay together as a single strata. We saw that as a route forward that made the most sense. That led to a number of other conversations where it became quite evident that what we really should be doing is subdividing. And therefore, the properties are becoming two, and that's partly why we've led to the variance that's on the list, and as well more roads, because there was 2 separate lots, and therefore the need to be able to service and access them independently. So there's the strata dialogue that's been going on and is ongoing. We email, converse, telephone consistently with them. They were our immediate group. Our first meeting with the West Sechelt Community Association, they had a number of concerns, but the very obvious one was that we were 3 stories in an area that did not want that. And despite the fact that there are a number of single-family homes in the immediate vicinity that have 3 stories, we understood the concern, and you know, we had put a lot of time into getting to the stage we were at to have proper dialogue with them about that project. But what we did from there was look at the idea of saying, well, what if we took it down a story? How would that work? And there were some losses and there were some gains. And in the end, the big gain, in my opinion, is that there is, the project's more in keeping with where it was originally going 15 years ago. And rather than introducing yet another typology, it's going to blend more in terms of the height, scale, massing, et cetera. Now, since that dialogue and the transition from 3-story to 2-story, we've gone through quite a number of iterations of 2-story, not necessarily meeting with the West Sechelt Community Association, but receiving information from them through the planning department and through word of mouth and what people are concerned about. The last meeting we had here, we took very careful notes on where the concerns were and where the misinterpretations were, and did our best since that last meeting to really carefully analyze them. There have been a couple of minor shifts here and there. In fact, one thing we've been looking further at that will help is that the color modifications, you know, if we wanted to achieve a little bit more color diversity, we could do that. The exterior stairs, we looked at taking those off and changing the grade so you only got in the bottom and then the top, et cetera. But in the end of the day, we've pushed this as hard as we can in the direction that it is, in the shape and the massing and the number of units, et cetera. So we think that we've achieved, in terms of the overall form and character, as much as we can with respect to those responses.
Thank you for that lengthy response. I'll go to Councillor Seegers and then back to Councillor Inkster if he has a shorter question. Councillor Seegers, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Could you address lot coverage? And then I understand you're also wanting to speak to the variance.
That's a second. Yeah.
If I answer your second question first, I would speak to the variance, but I think the planning department has it so well covered that, and it's a very succinct little thing to understand. For me to speak to it probably doesn't make a lot of sense, and it gives me more time for those long answers. The site coverage is, essentially, there are a number of different ways to calculate it, but if you take the buildings, the parking, and the driveways, and then that's the wording of the zoning, essentially, those combined come out at about 39% of the property. If you then add in the roadways, it gets up above 60%, 64.9. And, you know, roadways are open space, and we would prefer to have fewer, but because we went down the route of creating 2 separate entities, the requirement to look at separating became obvious, and therefore more access, unfortunately.
And allowable in the zoning is 75%?
Yes.
Thank you for that. And Councillor Inkster.
Maybe with that extra coverage, you use permeable materials.
We've already incorporated quite a few and could quite easily look at more as well.
Okay.
Even raised walkways that are permeable.
Okay, great. So my question was if you, and you've been up to the site a number of times.
Quite a number.
Okay. So when you stand and look at the site, and Piccadilly Park's over here, and there's a number of buildings here, and then in front of the development and behind, did you compare the heights of your proposal to not only the ones at Piccadilly Park right in front of them, what I kind of find is a cool sort of San Francisco look, those taller houses, but also in behind with some quite tall houses to what you're proposing. And the reason I'm asking that is there is some concern over height. And I wanted to know from you, based on the work that you've done, because I can't easily do it unless I do some Pythagorean stuff or climb on people's roofs. Tell me how they compare in height to the other buildings in the general vicinity that people are also having to look through and or around and or over.
Yeah, we certainly did that. I would say that getting into a technical review of it, we did not do. Yeah. However, the aesthetic review, the intent to, as closely as possible, keep in track with the original plan for that property with the approved DP, and managed to come up with a scheme with the split level parking entry so that we didn't have to completely bury the lower floor in the back, or didn't have to raise it up higher in order to come in at the lower floor. That was probably our key driving force, was the existing strata and where it was to be developed to. But across the street, it's quite a varied group of heights. There's I think a 3-story, a 2, possibly a 1, and then another 2, and so on. And the houses behind, yeah, we were doing everything we could to try and keep those buildings that we're proposing to be as low as possible. The buildings in the back, ironically, are trickier to do that because the services are higher. They're higher underground. They're not as low as the other ones. So going down further is trickier. Plus the road work is trickier. As soon as those go down more, you run into issues with coming off the street and so on. But there has been a lot of review of the grading and the surrounding massing.
Thank you very much for that response.
Did that answer?
He's answered that.
Taller and shorter. They're both. If you were to look at them as a specific application per building, they're lower and pretty much on par, except for the single-story houses.
And there was a slide that showed very clearly what the zoned heights were and what these ones are.
Yes.
And around that neighborhood, some reach the maximum and some don't. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship. Could you talk a little bit about the parking, in particular, the small number of visitors' parking spots?
Right. Our take on the parking is that one of the reasons for putting one stall inside and one stall outside was that purchasers, obviously we don't have buyers yet, people purchasing will know what they're getting into. They know they have a stall inside, it's warm, it's comfortable. The exterior stalls, there will be a lot less interest, and therefore there won't be as much use of them. They'll be more intent on using that single car to migrate through their day, but also we definitely see quite a number of those stalls being empty, and therefore part of our what you would call visitor parking.
Thank you for that response. Further follow-up? Councillor Wright.
It's wishful, but that's the intent.
As somebody who owns 5 vehicles,
they're not buying here.
I might. It's very difficult for me to understand a married couple that are going to survive with one vehicle, and so I'm not so sure that visitor's parking spot that you think is going to be outside is going to be there. And I'm expecting that you're going to end up with a lot of street parking if you don't address visitors parking down the road to accommodate it. That's a comment. I don't need it. If you want to comment on it, fine.
That's fine.
I understand.
Thank you for this long discussion, and thank you very much for not speaking to the second issue on the agenda, because that is concise and fairly
I'm sure that was more than 10 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you, Mayor, councillors, and staff. Thank you.
Our second delegation this evening is the West Sechelt Community Association, and Mr. Sangster, I think, would start and then turn it over to your colleagues. And again, we'll try and keep it to 10 minutes, and then if there's questions, I might extend it a bit. And,
okay, sounds
we'll try
good.
and be fair, equal on these things.
I don't need to push the button, I guess.
No, you're on.
Good evening, Mayor Milne, members of the council, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to be a delegation today. What we have before us is the full presentation citing concerns of the West Sechelt Community Association and neighbors regarding the proposed Ocean View Villas development proposal for 5520 McCourt Road at Jasper Road. We hope you all have had the opportunity to read the full presentation. This presentation was presented at the Planning Committee meeting on February the 28th, 2018. 10 minutes is not enough time to get through it all, so we have decided to give a brief summary instead. Our two major concerns are density and building on raised grade. In 2004, a development proposal was submitted to the District of Sechelt by Seaview Villas. The proposal was to build 11 duplex buildings. These buildings were 1 story with a walkout basement. This development proposal was approved by the District of Sechelt and is to this day the only approved plan. What the residents of the neighboring properties liked about this plan is that density was reasonable, 11 buildings, 22 units in total. Building design had an architectural appeal for a single-family dwelling neighborhood. The lower level of the buildings were at street level, similar to the neighboring properties, not shadowing other buildings or obliterating views of surrounding neighbors. Only 2 roads entering and exiting the complex were necessary. Both were off McCourt Road. This was all that was needed to service all 11 buildings, which provided for a fair amount of green space and plenty of parking, as each half of the duplex had a double-car garage. Unfortunately, that approved plan was never completed. Fast forward to 2015, 11 years later, after the entire neighborhood has been developed. In 2015, the Strongman Group purchased the remaining property. From that day to the present, our community has never been approached for consultation by the owner, even though he was aware that we had very real concerns about what was going to be built there. The latest proposal is to build 8 fourplex buildings on the remaining plot of land for a total of 32 additional units. This is a 128% increase over the approved 14 more units. What the residents don't like about the new proposal is density. The proposed density is extreme. 8 fourplex building is the maximum number of units allowed for that size of property. We are not New York or Toronto or even Vancouver. We don't need maximum density coverage. We want our neighborhoods to look pleasant with plenty of green space. With the new proposal, as you can see on page 2 of our full presentation, the density is so high that much of the roadways and parking spaces need to be located on setbacks. There is also another exit necessary off McCourt Road and yet another off Jasper Road. There are only 2 designated parking spaces for guests, and we feel that because of this, Jasper Road will become a parking lot. The residents along Jasper Road do not want to see this happen. It is already a very busy road with cars parked up and down all the way to McCourt Road whenever there is an activity such as a soccer game in Piccadilly Park. Think of how congested the street will be if this project goes forward as proposed. Building on raised grade. The Ocean View Villas development proposal indicates building the fourplex units on raised grade. Although the contour of the land slopes considerably from west to east, the Strongman Group want to build on level land, thus requiring supporting retaining walls gaining height the further east they build. These huge retaining walls, whether they are tiered or not, will cause massive shadowing to adjacent properties, particularly on the east side. This is not in line with the District of Sechelt's OCP bylaw number 492. They also want to build 2-story buildings instead of the 1-story with a walkout basement, as is the case with phase 1 of Seaview Villas. This proposed 2-story design will cause significant shadowing to the immediately adjacent buildings and will obliterate the views of people on Samron Road. This is inconsiderate and disrespectful to our community and will cause a significant devaluation of our properties. Also, if this proposed development is allowed to proceed, the homes on the south side of Samron Road will not only lose their view, but they will also lose their privacy. The stacked townhouses units that Strongman Group are proposing will have windows looking into our backyards, decks, and bedrooms. The Seaview Villas proposal has almost all of their windows facing south and east and are only one story. As you can see from the many letters you have received from the residents in the community, along with the petition of more than 130 signatures, the people of this community care about our town. The majority of us moved here to enjoy our retirement years in a beautiful, quiet, and serene environment with lovely gardens, clean air, and wide open spaces. The proposed Ocean View Villas development does not provide any of this. Quite the contrary, as their proposal wants to cram as many buildings, stacked townhouses, roadways, and parking spaces as possible into a lovely, already established family community, resulting in over 65% of the land being covered, obliterating views, shadowing adjacent homes, and destroying the quiet serenity of an already established family neighborhood. This is unfair to all of us who take pride in our homes and community. We feel that with some consultation between the developer and the community and a little imagination, we could come up with something that works for everyone. I'd like to talk a little bit about the process. The neighbors and community can't help but wonder as to the steps taken to move this proposal from the application phase to where we are now. It seems as though the planning department staff want to push this project through regardless of how the residents in the area feel. When we mentioned in our presentation on February 28th, 2018, that at the November 9th, 2017 Advisory Planning Commission meeting, the information provided to the APC regarding site coverage was incorrect. It was stated that the proposed Seaview Villas approved plan of 2004 allowed for more site coverage, but the site coverage was not provided. The APC did not know what the site coverage was, yet they approved the application, and we felt that the application should have been resubmitted to the APC with the proper accurate information. We did not receive any explanation, response, and nothing was done to address our concern. This proposal then moved to the Planning Committee meeting on February the 28th, where the variance request application was defeated. After this step, we thought that the Strongman Group would need to make changes to their plans. Unexpectedly, we received a phone call from their realtor suggesting that if the Strongman Group listened to our concerns, would it be possible to move forward? I assured him that it would be, but we never heard back from him. I called him back a few days later, only to find out that the Strongman Group decided that they didn't need to get the approval of the residents. They only needed to get the district's approval. We were very surprised to learn that even though the variance application was turned down, the application was again moved forward to council. As we view it, there seems to be flaws in the system. We are wondering what is going on behind closed doors. In our opinion, we feel getting information from the planning department is no easy task. We feel as though they look upon us as hostiles and try to keep us in the dark.
Thank you. And the tag team, the second.
Thanks. Just as some response to Mike Lightbody's comments on confusion and things that are causing problems between the two groups. So we'll take an opportunity to provide some clarification on any confusions. Regarding the easements, we do admit that we were a little unclear on the intricacies between easements and setbacks. However, we do know that even setbacks are there to create privacy and separation between properties through the use of green space. Due to the excessive density of the buildings, the developer has no other recourse but to utilize the setbacks to complete the roadways and parking areas for the development. This is not an acceptable solution to excessive building coverage. We are opposed to the developer paving over the setbacks and placing roadways and parking stalls right up against property lines. Regarding the grade, the land has a significant natural slope and the buildings should not be tiered down along the natural slope of the land to fit in with all the other homes. In the neighborhood, should not be tiered down along the natural slope of the land to fit in with all the other homes in the neighborhood and avoid elevated buildings and the need for these massive tiered walls. We're glad to hear that the piles of dirt are a hindrance and will be removed. Strongman illustration, the one marked 2.0, unfortunately misses one of the piles in the northeast corner. The property grades and stuff like that were shown, were provided to Strongman from the district are maybe accurate, but they're not accurate in what the current situation is right now. The original Seaview Villa duplexes were designed to start at street level and remain so all along Jasper to the east corner without any issues in regards to already existing services installed on the property. If Lightbody has a need to build up the property with retaining walls due to the fact that they want to build stacked townhouses, perhaps they should reconsider changing the design. After all, a building should be designed and built to the land, not the land manipulated to accommodate the building design. Exterior stairs. It is realized that each proposed unit will have access to their dwelling through the shared garage. Our concern with respect to the exterior stairs is that it does not comply with the District of Sechelt OCP Bylaw 492/2010. Specifically in the DPA 7 form and character, it clearly states, enclose all stairwells to the upper story of residential units. It's unfortunate that that the proposed meeting mentioned by Mr. Sangster between the neighbors and the Strongman group didn't take place. It would have stemmed the confusion for both parties. Strongman would not have had to submit this evening's presentation, providing a rebuttal to the association's submissions. Their presentation has only highlighted more concerns and/or created additional confusion and concern for the association. Likewise, the West Sechelt Community Association and Neighborhood would not have had to provide tonight's submission either. This development is the last piece of the neighborhood. We encourage the Strongman Group to have a meeting with the community to hear the concerns, work with its neighbors to identify and develop a development that everyone can accept. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just before both of you leave, I'll see if there's any clarifications from councillors. Don't see it. One more from Councillor Inkster. Just, sir.
Robert, thanks for identifying some of the, sort of in a rebuttal to some of the information that you presented, and what Sangster said previous about some of the concerns I've been looking for where the neighborhood is and trying to meet this development. Just a question for you. At your very last line, you said I think development that everyone will like. That's really hard to do, and a lot of times in small towns is try to get a development that everyone likes. I'd love to see that because, you know, anyway, yeah.
I'd just like to say to that the community would like to see the same plan go through as what was originally approved. That is a plan that they're all on board with.
Well, hopefully everyone's in favor of the previous.
Well, and just for clarity, like the wording I chose was that everyone can accept. So not everybody's going to be happy. We get that. We know that the Holy Grail cannot be found here, no matter what we do. But I think the stressed part I want to articulate is the fact that we've never had a sit-down meeting with Strongman. We've been offered opportunity. We graciously accepted. It never panned out. I think the meeting between the associations in general with any developer should happen at the early stages. If someone walked around door to door to the neighborhood to say, hey, this is what we're planning in our local neighborhood on this plan and development, what do you think? How much input they would have had before they even put pen on paper or money down on a property. Certainly, we voice our concerns, and we have done now for quite some time. Our intention is to work with the developer. We know something's going in there at some point. We know it's not going to be a park. We know it's not going to be vacant land. Everybody built under the plan for the Seaview Villas that they had posted on their website. We accepted the fact. Now the game has changed. I think the key part here is that this development is the last piece of the puzzle. The entire neighborhood shouldn't have to pay the price for it. I hate to say that we were there first. That's not the intent of this. But the fact is, I think the community should have a significant input on this development just because everybody will be affected by it regardless of what gets built.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation, and we will come back to this later in the agenda. I'm sorry we can't move it forward as we sometimes do because there's other issues that people are waiting for as well. So it's probably be about 45 minutes from now if I judge, maybe a little bit more. We'll try and get to it as quickly as we can. And thank you to the audience for their receptive response to both of the presentations. Sometimes when we get a full house, people get more antsy. But I do think it's the very first time I've heard anyone say amen in a council meeting. So we'll have to work on on that side of our presentation so we can get a few more amens when we do the right thing or not. Moving on, there are no proclamations this evening, but we do move to item 5, which is adoption of the minutes of the previous council meeting. And these are the minutes of the Wednesday, April 18th, 2018 council meeting. A motion to receive and adopt. Thank you, Councillor Wright and Councillor Seegers seconding. Any errors or omissions in those minutes? Seeing no errors or omissions worth noting, all those in favor of adoption? That's carried. And is there any business arising from those minutes? Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. With regards to recommendation number 14 on page 37, this is with regards to the Van Key development, and there was a variance permit, and I noted that it was publicly recommended or mentioned in the paper, but it didn't actually mention that we've done a variance on bylaw 430 to actually increase the requirements for road standards. So typically when we do a variance, it's to the benefit of the developer. In this case, it's to the benefit of the community to up the standards. So I just wanted to publicly make a note of that. Thanks.
Is there any business arising that people would like a follow-up on or to know how things are proceeding? Thank you for that. We'll move along then to the committee meeting minutes of, this is item 7.1, minutes of the Planning and Community Development Committee of Wednesday, April 25th. Motion to receive. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Shanks. Any errors or omissions in those? Any of those recommendations that anyone would like to pull out for more direct discussion? And they do move us a step closer to the BC Housing, which will come a little bit later in our agenda. If there's none to pull out, could I have a motion to adopt recommendations through to 15? Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Councillor Shanks. All those in favor? That's carried. Moving then to our bylaws, we have some for first reading. And we'll start with 8.1. Brought forward for first reading is the, Mermac. Let's start with a motion to receive the report from the community planner. Thank you, Councillor Shanks and Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? And our community planner, Mr. Thompson, is at the microphone, so we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Your Worship. This is a relatively simple report based off of the previous council meeting. Council made a motion to authorize staff to draft a bylaw amendment for the zoning bylaw to rezone this property from RR1 to R1. And now I'd like to present that bylaw amendment to council for first reading. We are also looking at possible scheduling dates for the public hearing for it, if council wishes to give it first reading, and I believe we're looking at Tuesday in about 2 weeks, in conjunction with a potential another public hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Any questions of the community planner? Someone to move recommendations 2 and 3. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Wright, and that recommendation 2 is to provide first reading. Recommendation 3 is for the public hearing. All those in favor? That's carried. And that does take us then directly to first reading. This is bylaw number 25-290-218, Mermac Construction, a bylaw to amend District of Sechelt zoning bylaw number 25-1987, soon to be fixed and brought into 2018 or 19, by rezoning a property in the West Porpoise Bay neighborhood from RR1 to R1. First reading is moved by Councillor Wright, Councillor Shanks, and discussion at first reading. Councillor Wright. Sorry, did I try again? Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm looking at dates at the bottom of the bylaw. 2016, I suspect it should be.
I hope that's not an indication of how long it takes to get anything done at the District of Sechelt. My goodness.
Thank you.
That does not deserve an amen. Is that when it started?
That was a typo that didn't seem to get fixed onto the agenda. Sorry about that, but I have fixed that. This version made it on, so I apologize.
Okay. To be clear, first reading is moved by Councillor Wright and seconded by Councillor Shanks for first reading of this bylaw on the second day of May 2018. All in favor? None opposed. That's carried. Thank you for catching that. (8.2) is the Mobius Architecture and BC Housing, Supportive Housing. We have 100 pages in this report. And first, a motion to receive the report from the municipal planner. Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Councillor Lutz seconding. All those in favor? That's carried, and we could turn it to Ms. Lettman, our municipal planner. Thank you.
Mayor and Council, I have a presentation to give you. Some background information. The subject property is located on High Tide Avenue and backs onto Lamprey Lane and onto an undeveloped section of High Tide Avenue. Adjacent properties are, there's an apartment building located to the north. In this location here, there's a number of single-family bungalows. This is a non-conforming, approximately 6-unit apartment building. The existing shelter is located in the upper deck and with the surrounding businesses. There's a storage facility here. This is community services building, as well as the community gardens and the food bank. There's the Ebb Tide Village townhome development here, and this portion of that property is the undeveloped last phase. There's also another townhouse development in this area and a duplex here, and I believe this as well is either a duplex or a fourplex. You saw, I believe, last year, the Ebb Tide Muse proposed site is in this location here. The property on the legal plan, I can just barely see it there, is labeled 0.1820 hectares. We assumed that meant 1,820 square meters, but in actual fact, it is 1,817 square meters, which meant that the density proposed is increased by 1 unit. So instead of 220 units per hectare, the request is for 221 units per hectare. This is a survey of the property. It shows the green lines are the existing pavement here. Where the turnaround is actually a good portion of that is on the property. Lamprey Lane is approximately right along the property line here. So it's a rather narrow dedication there of 5 meters. This is an aerial shot of the site. There is, even in this photograph, there's an abandoned vehicle at the end of High Tide here. And this little truck with a canopy is actually someone who lives, at least that's what a person in the neighborhood told me, lives here and operates a small repair shop in that trailer. Now, one of the other things I wanted to show on here was the pedestrian trails. You can see quite clearly coming off the end of High Tide and then onto Lamprey. And here as well along the road right-of-way is another trail, and there's significant, not as significant, but there are some mature trees in this area that members of the public have identified that they would like to have saved as much as, so we're going to endeavor to do that. This is a shot from Google looking back towards up along High Tide. And across the site, there is one mature fir tree located almost exactly in the corner of the site on High Tide Avenue. These are the trees that you'll see coming up in the tree survey that staff did, and this is the tree survey. So you can see the property line here, the existing property line, that large fir tree, and then there's a number of trees in here, mostly cedar, a couple of large firs, 2 dogwoods that are now out in with their brackets in bloom, and there are 2 small arbutus at that location. The official community plan designation of the property is multifamily mixed residential, as well as the surrounding area is that as well, and to the south is the downtown center designation, as well as all of those bungalows back that they are across Lamprey Lane are also downtown center. So the movement for that in the future is to be rezoned. And this is the current zoning is R4 for multifamily. which allows apartments and townhouses. And you can see the surrounding area, the yellow area is also R4, with commercial areas to the south. The proposal. This is a proposed site plan. It's not in a lot of detail, but you can see on the ground floor, they're attempting to have 8 units with an area for dining and lounge, for amenity services such as medical office, laundry, commercial kitchen, reception, and admin offices. There are also, too far. There are also some outdoor areas there. You can see a vegetable garden indicated, as well as some storage sheds. So these are all kinds of things that might occur in the final plans, and that will be coming forward for a development permit application. These are the proposed conceptual massing. The building is proposed at 3 stories with the same lot coverage limitation as R4, and we'll go into a comparison of R4. So that's what's proposed along High Tide Avenue. And the red indicates what R4 would permit. So essentially the exact same footprint, except for a small portion is coming forward out here. The setback, instead of 6 meters, is 3 meters at this time. From Lamprey Lane, looking back across, you can see the building does very well fit within the outline of what an R4 building could be. And then in the permitted uses of R4 compared to the CD proposed, everything is unchanged except for the number of units and the 1 setback that was proposed there. And the minimum parking is also looking at a variance from what would be approximately 22 spaces for 15 units, looking at 5 spaces for 40 units. And I'll get to the rationale around that when we get to the bylaws. Proposed road closure. The road closure is something that staff identified. The existing road here is 24 meters wide. There's a potential, a normal road is only 20 meters, to reduce that. Staff are proposing 2 meters so that the trees will remain on that road right away, and we can work to have a kind of green space in between the property. That will allow the building to shift. So instead of having 3 meters here, you would have 5 meters. The building will shift over to approximately this location. This building is at the narrowest point here, just over 6 meters. So that gives us a total, if it was shifted, to just over 11 meters in separation between the 2 buildings. Off-site walkway improvements that staff are recommending. You can see here the existing sidewalk on High Tide ends, and we're looking to have that continued to the frontage. The developer would be responsible for the improvements to the frontage. And then we're also asking for improvements to Lamprey Lane in this area here. The improvements we're looking at in terms of Lamprey Lane, it's very limited because of the width. They're looking at an on-surface pavement demarcation with vinyl, similar to the crosswalks you see on Cowrie. They would have the Xing out for pedestrians and be reflective to sort of designate where we want to see pedestrians. Because unfortunately at this time we only have that 5 meter wide, and we're looking for road width of 4.5, so there's some limitations there in terms of walkway widths. We're asking them to continue the walkway to this corner where Lamprey Lane, this portion is wider, and then this is extended here. We feel that pedestrians will be coming like this. There is a bus stop near there, on there. One of the things we didn't include in the report was the Accessibility Advisory Committee recommendations. They met this morning, and those recommendations are as follows. They recommend to Council the approval of the OCP amendment application to increase the allowable density on the property to allow a maximum of 40 residential units in the 3-story building for a non-profit, independent supported rental housing, with the condition that a housing agreement be registered and 4 wheelchair accessible units be provided, and the remainder of the units on the ground floor be provided to an adaptable standard. They felt concerned that there may not be room for an additional 4 units on the ground floor. So they wanted to leave the adaptable units number kind of flexible in case there was only 7 units provided on the ground floor. And that's something council may wish to consider. They also advised that the approval of the zoning amendment application to create a zone for a 40-unit supportive housing 3-story building, conditional upon a housing agreement for 100% of the units be affordable housing, and 4 wheelchair accessible units be provided, and the remainder of the units on the ground floor be provided to an adaptable standard. They also recommended that the partial road closure, so that provided the building footprint and number of units does not increase in size, and that the extended pedestrian walkway improvements are made. The proposed bylaws, I'm going to go over there in summary. You have them on the official community plan bylaw, and I don't see a page number on those. Anyway, they're item 8.2b, and the zoning bylaw is 8.2.c. In summary, we are identifying in the official community plan a new policy entitled Affordable Supportive Living Housing Development, BC Housing, High Tide Avenue. And it would say, notwithstanding any other provisions of the official community plan, the property legally known as Lot 1, and I'll not go into that as much, and that it has a base density of 50 apartment dwelling units per hectare of lot area. This is the exact same density that every other multifamily building has in the official community plan as a base density, which may be increased to a maximum density of 221 rental apartment units per hectare of lot area, or 40 rental apartment dwelling units on the lot, whichever is less. And I've put that in so that even if there is a road closure and the lot area increases, the number of units will not be increased, subject to the following conditions. Providing 4 of the dwelling units are constructed to an adaptable accessible standard, and 4 of the dwelling units are built to a wheelchair accessible standard with wheelchair roll-in showers, wheelchair accessible sinks, counters, and kitchenettes. And providing 100% of the dwelling units on the lot are guaranteed as affordable housing, where the District of Sechelt and the owner have entered into a housing agreement under Section 483 of the Local Government Act to provide not-for-profit rental housing. And providing that the building is no more than 3 stories in height with a maximum of 1.1 FAR, and that's floor area ratio to the site area. Moving on to the zoning bylaw. In summary, we're creating some new definitions. We actually never did have a definition of floor area ratio in our zoning bylaw. We had it under a specific zone, CD zone. So we're bringing in a definition that matches the definition in the official community plan. We're also defining supportive living housing, meaning a residential rental housing facility which provides apartment dwelling units or sleeping units and support and amenity services. And then we define support and amenity services. That means meal preparation, meal service, administration services, and may include the following: counseling, medical services, social and recreation uses, house cleaning, laundry services provided to residents in conjunction with their supportive living housing or assisted living housing. The reason we're trying to make this a more generic so that it would apply to something like the Lions Housing should they bring in a new application, or to something like the Spaney proposal for Rockwood that would have a definition there. And because the sleeping unit is mentioned in another part of the bylaw, we're bringing in sleeping unit as well in this location. So the part 3 of the zoning amendment bylaw creates a new CD43 zone for this BC housing, a site-specific zone. And the principal uses are supportive living housing, apartment dwelling units. The accessory uses are support and amenity services, and any accessory buildings or structures such as a gazebo or a garden shed that may be up there would follow the regular regulations in the bylaw. The other portion of the bylaw talks about density. You can see that it's for the not exceed a base density of 1 unit for 200 square meters of lot area. And then notwithstanding that section, the number may be increased to 1 for every 45.425 square meters, or 220 units per hectare. I know it's flipped constantly, but the The zoning bylaw treats it in one way, as a unit per part of a hectare, whereas the official community plan talks about the number of units per 1 hectare. So that's why you get a little bit of differentiation of the numbers there. Or 40 supportive living housing apartment dwellings on the lot, whichever is less, subject to the following conditions. And I think that those, I've gone over those. The only new one at this point here is C, the provision of a no subdivision covenant registered on the lot. I believe that's the way we can protect the rental housing so that it will never be stratified at this point. Beyond that is the intent. Point 3 of the bylaw talks about lot area and width. So we're making that 1,800 meters squared and 36 meters wide. The FAR is at 1.10. The lot coverage is at 75%. That's exactly what the R4 zoning is. For that's the buildings, the parking areas, and the driveways. The building height is 10.5 meters. The siding is 7.5 meters east and west, 3 meters to the south and 5 meters to the north. We have a clause in there on exterior lighting because that was some of a bit of a concern of the Advisory Planning Commission, and something we can address at the development permit stage as well, that all pathways be lit and that doorways be lit on the outside. In terms of off-street parking and loading, we're asking for the size and the design of the parking aisles, spaces, and loading be in accordance with Part 11 of the bylaw, and that the number of parking spaces and loading be provided as Part 11, but then notwithstanding that, if there is this agreement that these things are provided, that they may be going down to 5 vehicle parking spaces, of which at least 1 vehicle parking space shall be designed as accessible parking, and that there be no loading space required if the following conditions are met. So provision of 100% of the supportive living apartment dwellings are guaranteed as affordable. Provision of the no subdivision covenant, again, should help, as well as provision of a covered bicycle parking area for at least 15 bicycles. So recommendations and options, you have your recommendations. Your option 1 is that the recommendations 1 to 7 as presented in your package be endorsed. Number 2 is that in lieu of a partial road closure, that the southern lot lines building side yard setback be revised from 3 meters to 1 meter in the proposed zoning amendment bylaw. This would allow the building to shift to the same location as if it had a 5-meter setback on the other side. And our other option is that you put it back to the planning for reconsider with some changes, or that the application be denied. Staff strongly support the application. Some of the conditions we'd be looking at before adoption would be a development permit for multifamily housing. So it would come before council and the community with detailed design drawings so that the committee and council and the community would have an opportunity to look at the final design as well as the landscaping that's being proposed. We would also bring back the housing agreement, which must be considered by council and passed by bylaw, so there'll be 4 readings of the bylaw. There would be a covenant to secure 4 accessible and 4 adaptable apartments. The Sechelt Nation asked for an archaeological preliminary field reconnaissance study, and we put that in there as a requirement for consideration. And we're looking for securement of the off-site walkway improvements for portions of High Tide Avenue and Lamprey Lane. And that's the end. Thank you, Mayor and Council.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And I'm sure there'll be some questions and clarifications. I have 1 or 2 myself. Can you go, can you just go backwards in your slide presentation? About, I don't know if it's 7 or 8 slides, so.
To the site plan, or?
Just right, the next one.
This is the zoning bylaw?
Yeah.
That one?
You had mentioned the sections of the bylaw, and it's not in that, so maybe it's the next slide. And can you continue?
Next one?
Yeah. And the next. Next. Okay. I'd heard you say section 11. And I was,
I meant, sorry, when I was talking about the parking, I meant part 11, I believe, of the bylaw.
Okay.
Is where all the parking and loading
because
is.
I was looking at
So I
the
apologize.
bylaw for section. I thought we stopped at 9. We did stop at 9.3. That was my mishearing, not your misspeaking. While Ms. Latman is at the microphone, councillors have any questions or clarifications on some of these issues? And then I'm going to go through the recommendations one by one just to keep track of them because there are quite a few, 7. And just before we go to that, when we come back to the recommendations, I noticed that the partial road closure it's down under options, but it's not actually one of the recommendations in bold. So we don't want to miss that if we want to address it. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. 7C. So following up on the Accessibility Advisory Committee recommendations, 7C indicates 4 accessible and 4 adaptable apartments. You had different wording that they had brought forward that we could put in there, and I didn't quite catch what that could be.
They specifically mentioned wheelchair accessibility, and I'm not sure if
I think they were addressing the fact that they may not be 4 units, it might be 3 units. And
So what they had recommended is that 4
remainder of
accessible units, that meaning wheelchair accessible, be provided, and that the remainder of the units on the ground floor be provided to an adaptable standard.
Thank you.
So it could
is there
be,
any particular reason why we would give the proponent that kind of flexibility? If they're proposing 8 units, why we wouldn't just say 8 units?
yeah, and also an adaptable unit could be perhaps when we get the
Yes.
development permit drawings looked at, maybe there's one that could be provided upstairs. I don't recommend it, but maybe there's a mobility issue that could still be still accommodate stairs. There is no elevator proposed in the building.
3 stories, okay. And that's in recommendation 7. Yeah. Any other questions or clarifications from the development, municipal planner? Too many names here, municipal planner. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship. It has to do with the road closure. I'm a little bit nervous about starting a process to close a road or a portion of a road. And if there's any other development that happens in that area, we've now narrowed the road up. And every time that there's something that comes to council about a road, it's always to make sure that there's a bike lane or a scooter lane and things like that. And so when we know that that's the kind of request that we get, I get real nervous when we start to narrow the road up. And so I know that you suggested an alternative in there, that we could shift the building, and I guess from my perspective, I would prefer that as to closing the road.
Perhaps you could comment on the fact that if we did do a road closure, it would bring it to the maximum standards for all other municipal roads. It's 20 meters and it's currently...
If we close it to close 2 meters, we would still have 22 meters of dedication of road width. So that normally we have only 20 meters. So we still have larger amount of dedication. It's more about the trees and if we do want to protect the trees or not. But given that we're hoping to come up with a design that brings the road through here and down along this fence line in this open area here. And that will allow the trees, we hope as many as possible, to be saved, and they would be like a little mini green space for the community.
Okay, we'll get to the road closure as a separate item a little bit later.
Yeah, it's actually item number 4, recommendation 4.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Anything else while Ms. Latman's at the microphone? Then if you don't mind, just to go through these recommendations numerically and one at a time, do I have anyone to move the second recommendation, which is the recommendation for council to bring this to first reading and for the official community plan amendment and zoning bylaw for first reading? Councillor Seegers, Councillor Lutz, lots of enthusiasm there. All those in favor? That one's carried. Then, did I move too quickly and somebody wanted to speak to it? Councillor Inkster?
Yes, thank you. It is lots of enthusiasm. It's a good project, and I just wanted to applaud BC Housing for stepping up and helping us with our housing needs in our community, and I hope they continue to do that when we identify further needs. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Recommendation number 3, moved by Councillor Lutz and Councillor Seegers, and this one is that Council directs staff and BC Housing to begin a housing agreement process for 100% of the apartment units in the affordable supportive housing. And this is the housing agreement that keeps them as affordable housing. Any discussion of that item? It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor? That's carried. Item 4, and this is the recommendation that staff begin a road closure process for a portion of the undeveloped southern end of the high tide. Somebody to move that? Councillor Seegers? I was hoping Councillor Wright might move it. Councillor Shanks moved it. And discussion of that. Any further discussion? I would just point out that for many, many years, apparently, the road in practice, the cul-de-sac, has been on the private property. So moving it off private property and having a little bit of leeway on the other side of the road seems fair game after 40 years or whatever of them using it incorrectly. I don't know how the cul-de-sac was put on that property. It was before any of our time. Any further discussion of the road closure? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried, and thank you for clarifying that earlier, Ms. Latman. Item number 5, recommendation number 5, that we consider the official community plan in conjunction with the current financial plan, the RD solid waste management plan, the District of Sechelt liquid waste management plan, and the registration of the district wastewater treatment plant regulation. Moved, Councillor Wright, seconded by Councillor Shanks. All those in favor? That's carried. And recommendation 6, and this is for referrals, that we refer the official community plan amendment out to the school district, to the downtown village neighborhood, Sechelt Nation, Sunshine Coast Regional District, utility companies, fire department, Canada Post, Transportation, Coastal Health, Advisory Planning Commission, and the Accessibility Advisory Committee, though they have seen parts of it already. Anything we should add to those referrals? Moved by Councillor Inkster, seconded by Councillor Seegers. Any discussion? All those in favor? That's carried. And the final recommendation on this is that the final adoption of zoning amendment bylaw number 25293 be conditional on the provision of the following provisions. Provision of the following: an application for development permit for multiple family housing, a housing agreement to be entered into to provide 100% affordable rental housing, a covenant to secure the ground floors for accessible, and that's wheelchair accessible, and for adaptable apartments, and archaeological preliminary field reconnaissance and securement of the off-site. First, we'll get it moved onto the table. Councillor Wright, Councillor Shanks, and discussion and potential amendments. I recognize Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. I'd like to propose an amendment to 7C to read a covenant to secure the ground floors for accessible and the remainder of the units to be provided to an adaptable standard. Or with the remainder of the units provided.
A covenant to secure 4 accessible units on the ground floor.
With the remainder of the units provided to an adaptable standard.
Did staff get that? Municipal planner.
And just for clarification, is that the remainder of the units on the ground floor or all of the buildings? All the ground, okay, the ground floor only.
That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to recognize the work of the Accessibility Committee this morning. And staff, I think council knows what they're doing, and the wording staff can work on. Any discussion of that item? It's been, the amendment needs to be seconded. Thank you. Councillor Wright seconds the amendment. Corporate officer, we're now on the amendment only. Yeah. Discussion of the amendment. All those in favor? That's carried. So then we go back to the main motion, which is the 5 following provisions as amended. Any discussion of that? It's on the floor. All those in favor? That's carried. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. I seem to recall during your presentation you mentioned something about a covenant be registered to ensure that the units are remain as rental units.
That's the housing agreement, or is there
Is
a
that
covenant
something
as
else
well?
that needs to be added in here?
I've put it in the zoning bylaw, so it will be coming forward as well. Yeah,
Okay,
I don't
thank
think it needs to go in per se, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for all that work. We're actually now going, do we get to first reading tonight? Yes, that's the next item, 8.2B and C, and then we'll congratulate staff and BC Housing for all their work. We'll wait another 10 minutes, less than that. Item 8.2B is the official community plan amendment of District of Sechelt, official community plan bylaw number 492-2010 in support of an affordable supportive housing development. That's read for a first time today. Councillor Wright and Councillor Seegers putting it on the floor. Any discussion? All those in favor? That's carried. And the bylaw, which is item 8.2C, bylaw number 25293, 2018, BC Housing, a bylaw to amend District of Sechelt zoning bylaw number 25, 1987 by rezoning a property at 5656 High Tide Avenue from R4 residential 4 zone to comprehensive development zone 43, CD 43 BC Housing. And first reading is moved by Councillor Lutz and seconded by Councillor Seegers. Any discussion? All those in favor? That's carried. Thank you for council for their work. Thank you to the planning staff and to BC Housing and Rain City, who I saw in the back there a little while, and all the members of the community who supported this work. We've had quite a discussion in the community on affordable housing and supportive housing in the last while. We're about to have more as we move into the summer, because we need to be planning for this in serious ways. But this is a significant contribution by the province to the District of Sechelt's welfare, $5.9 to $6 million for this project alone, plus well over $1 million of operating to make sure that it is supported and the people in need are looked after. So thank you for everyone through this work. There were times when it was a bit challenging. Moving to item 8.3, which is our bylaws, bylaw number 564, road naming bylaw. Motion to receive the report. Thank you, Councillor Wright and Councillor Seegers. We've looked at it once already. Do you want to speak to it again? It's for adoption? Okay, straightforward to adoption then. Adoption of bylaw number 564, 2018, road naming, a bylaw to name several new streets, and adoption is moved by Councillor Seegers, Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? That's carried. Item 8.4, Parks, Lands and Roads Temporary Rental Agreement. Corporate officer.
Need to proceed with actually adopting the bylaw, voting on adoption.
I thought we just did.
You just adopted the recommendation.
No, and then I went directly to the bylaw and it was moved and seconded.
Thank you.
I read it out in loud. So, yes, when I realized we were proceeding to adoption, I just went straight to adoption. Thank you. And thank you for Councillor Seegers for watching that. If it had been an error, we would have been stopped. Item 8.4A, we have a report to receive. Thank you, Councillor Shanks and Councillor Seegers. All those in favor? And this is for a temporary rental amendment. Corporate officer thinks we know well enough what it is. So recommendation 2 is moved by Councillor Seegers and Councillor Shanks. All those in favor? And that takes us to item 8.4B, which is the actual bylaw. Bylaw number 480-2, 2018, a bylaw to amend Parks, Lands and Roads Temporary Rental Bylaw number 480, 2008. And adoption is moved by Councillor Seegers, Councillor Shanks, and the dates are correct. It's 2018. All those in favor? That's carried. Item 8.5, financial plan bylaw. Motion to receive the report. Thank you, and seconded by Councillor Shanks. All those in favor? Would you like to speak to it? We've got a full house. Corporate Officer or Director of Finance, anything to say on this? Director of Finance.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, this is the recommendation to adopt the 2018 to 2022 financial plan bylaw to basically provide for the capital and operating expenditures for the general sewer funds for the district based on the discussions that have occurred at the FCD committee meetings for the last 6 months.
Thank you. Total revenue expected $13 million and change. Property tax is 8.3 million of that. The rest comes from fees such as sewer fees, garbage fees, and associated permits and fees. Grants and donations about 1 million. So a big budget, but one that does put us towards a sustainable financial future. Moved by Councillor Wright. Actually, just make sure I do this right. Recommendation is that we proceed. That's moved by Councillor Wright and seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? And then moving to the bylaw itself. Bylaw number 563, 2018, a bylaw to adopt the financial plan for the years 2018 to 2022. Again, the dates are right. This is adopted on May 2nd, 2018. Moved by Councillor Shanks, Councillor Wright. All those in favor? That's carried, and our budget process for this year is done. Oh, we didn't want to do that with a full house. 8.6, 2018 tax rates bylaw. Motion to receive the report. Thank you, Councillors Lutz and Shanks. All those in favor? And the recommendation is that we proceed. Would you like to explain the tax rates?
Certainly.
Director of Finance. Tax rates are a bit higher than any of us like to live with.
Thank you, Your Worship. So in conjunction with the financial plan bylaw that was just adopted by Council, it's now in order to establish the tax rates for 2018. This bylaw increases the property taxes by 5.78% across the board equally along all property classes. That's 3% for capital renewal, infrastructure replacement, and 2.78% to maintain operations.
Thank you. And the 3% for capital is basically to ensure that we actually have money to pay for roads, sidewalks, streetlights, and et cetera, which has been running at a deficit since most of us can remember. And we hope with a 3% increase last year, this year, and in the future, we will actually reach a balance in approximately 18 years. That's how far behind we were, just so you know. The 2.78% increase is for operating and general changes, but with existing service levels, there's been no increase in service levels. Director of Finance.
And if I may, just one other comment, just kind of gets lost in here is the fact that we have not increased any other fees. So the sewer fee and garbage fee did not increase for 2018. So I don't actually have the exact percentage, but the 5.78% is just taxes, 0% for all others.
Yes, but most of these people live in West Sechelt, and they know there was a big increase last year, so they're not going to. But thank you for pointing out that this year it stayed the same. Okay. This is a bylaw for establishing tax rates for municipal, hospital, Sunshine Coast Regional District, and the Sunshine Coast Regional Recreation purposes for the year 2018, and adoption is moved by. See how there's so much less enthusiasm on this than there was with the housing. Councillor Shanks, I saw, and Councillor Seegers, thank you for seconding. All those in favor? That's carried. Okay. Finally, and thank you for your patience. It's about 24 minutes after. Item 10.1, the Seaview Villas Development Variance Permit Application. There's a motion to receive the report. Thank you, Councillor Seegers. Councillor Lutz. Mr. Thompson, do you want to speak to this? Or Ms. Corbett, Director of Planning and Community Development.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Aaron and I are going to tag team tonight for the first, these two items. For the Seaview Villas development variance permit, it was just to give some context as to why it is back and some of the issues. So this was recommended for defeat through Planning Committee on February 28th and referred back to us. But I wanted to clarify the intent on this. This is not uncommon when strata phases are severed. I think we've seen a bit of this before in front of council, and usually the mechanism to do that is through a revised Form P, which requires an applicant to go through the courts and petition. This was a negotiated agreement between Seaview and Ocean View. You know where it is because we talked about that. So Aaron's going to speak to some of the specifics on it, but just wanted to give context that regardless of what happened with Ocean View or what happened on that site, this development would still need to get a variance on those side yards to bring it into conformity. Otherwise, it's a non-conforming use, and that's a hardship to the condo, especially if you're reselling. So it's essentially a technical variance on this. It is not affecting the development on either side, but really as a result of because of how it was severed. If it was kept as a phase strata, it wouldn't have kicked into this at all.
So just for clarity, this is on the existing buildings.
Correct.
And it occurred because of subdivision.
Correct.
So where they drew the lot lines. Okay, Councillor Seegers? Okay. Any questions on that? And the recommendation from staff is that this be approved with the following conditions, and those conditions are in front of us, which is moving the setback on buildings B and D from 3 meters to 1.5, and the setback on the other side from 1 to 0.4 meters. Yes, Councillor Seegers.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. I know when this came forward to planning, we were not clear as to which portion the variance actually applied to. I think some of us were under the mistaken understanding that it actually applied to the new development. So this actually brings the existing development into alignment. Thank you.
Good, and that's why we have some time between planning committees and council meetings sometimes. Any further discussion? People understand what it is. You saw it on the map. A development permit variance requires council's approval, so that approval is moved by Councillor Seegers, Councillor Wright. All those in favor? And that's carried. And that also takes us through the 60-odd pages of Aaron's late amendment. So we moved through that. Thank you for catching that, and for those of us who had a chance to read it. 10.2, the Ocean Villas development permit application, and this is the one where we did hear from both the developer and the West Sechelt Community Association. We have a motion first to receive the report. Thank you. Seconded, Councillor Wright, Councillor Shanks. All those in favor? That's carried. And I'll turn it back to the planning staff. In this case, our director, Tracy Corbett.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. What I wanted to do in the beginning part of this presentation was to give some context on the development itself, how it came to be in R4, and also for the clarity of both council, but more so for the public, of what can be looked at through a development permit and what can't, to give some indication too of what your scope is on this. So I'll just go through some of the beginning part, and Aaron's going to go through the actual evaluation of the development permit. So we've had the opening of the context of it. Just to clarify, so OCP designation, it is consistent with, it is multifamily, mixed residential, and it's zoned R4. The proposal in front of you is for a strata development. It's 8 townhouses, 4 each, so it is stacked townhouse development, 32 units maximum with 64 parking spaces. That is the site layout. We'll come back to that in discussion on some of the figures, but just to point out, there were certain things that the applicant had to work with that were existing constraints on the site. I think the most significant is the fact that, one, it's almost triangular, which makes it very challenging on some of the siting applications. And as the applicant mentioned, the requirement to have separate access required a lot more roads. There's a certain redundancy in the road and in the access, which reduced some of the ability to have additional open space. On the previous strata development, in the first initial development proposal, it was a phased strata development, 3 phases, 11 duplexes, 2 each, 22 units. Only the phase 1 was completed with 4 duplexes. This was the initial zoning. This is going back quite some time. It was first zoned in 1995 as an R4 site. In looking at the archive, the planning rationale for it was a little vague on why this came about, but there were some land changes that happened there in parkland, so there was kind of a negotiated agreement around placing the R4 site in this place. This came forward as of the first development on this site came in place in 1995. First proposed 38 units. There's indication that it was revised down to 24. It was low-rise townhouses, similar in kind of basic pattern to what was proposed in the 2004. So in 2004, this was the original application on the duplexes. It was an interesting approach to an R4 site in terms of what was deemed to be allowed on there, because duplexes are not a listed use. But there was approach. I think initially there was suites to be in there. It was deemed to be conforming. The applicant did come back in 2006 for a revision, both to phase 2 and to phase 3. The applicant did not move forward on this because it went into foreclosure shortly after this. So in phase 2, it was going to be revised from 8 to 12 units, very similar to what is actually being proposed in the Ocean View development along that kind of second line of townhomes. That was part of that decision was the unit size was reduced significantly from what was in existing phase. In phase 3, there was a proposal that it's at the north end of the site to actually add a garden apartment and the unit count going from 6 to 9 units. So to clarify in there, this, because it really guides what we can ask the applicant for and what we can't. Because we are working within an OCP designation that lays out what they can do and what this site is intended for, the application in front of you is consistent with the OCP designation. It's also consistent with the zoning and has been in place since 1995. So many opportunities through there when no development was happening to actually have changed that zoning, which didn't occur. So we have an existing R4 zoning sitting on the site. Under a development permit process, we cannot alter density or use. The legislation is quite clear, and we did get legal opinion on this, of what could be varied and what could not through this process. In a form and character development permit, the legislation authorizes a number of things that we can do, that you can do, or depending on how it's delegated. You can impose conditions to the development permit, you can set standards, You can vary some zoning provisions, which we have done in the past around setback and how it sits, but you cannot alter density or use. And imposing those conditions and setting standards, they can only be done in alignment with what we've got in the OCP in the development permit area. So we have quite long guidelines in there. So you can set the conditions that relate to those guidelines, but not outside of those guidelines. For form and character development permits and multi-unit development, we can include requirements regarding the character of the development, the landscaping, the siting, the form, and the exterior design and the finishing. But, according to the legislation, only in relationship to the general character of the development, not the specifics. So it needs to be the general character, form and character, fit with the adjacent uses, not the specific of the window design or the roof design. Okay? So that's what we can and cannot do, and that guides what we've been able to do as staff, and what the applicant is asked to do, and what can happen in approval on development permits. It's also instructive for any future ones so that the public understands there are some things we can and cannot do. We are not in cahoots with the applicant. We are not ramming down the throats of a development we think is appropriate or not appropriate. It's really guided by a lot of the legislation. This is the current proposal in front of you. The application has tried to meet those guidelines, given those site constraints, given the existing development. As mentioned, there were a lot of workarounds around the existing service alignments, the existing road, and the extent of that site. Aaron will go through in a little more detail of what that looks like and how they have responded in detail. This gives you an indication just on the development data of what is being proposed, what it was previously, so what the original Seaview development looked like, and what the zone provisions are. So I think it's instructive when it was shown in the supportive housing proposal that you saw, what can be done as of right under an R4 in terms of development and what that volume of development can look like, and the height. It is significantly higher than, and a different kind of building than what is showing up here. So in terms of what we have done and worked with, they are well within kind of the envelope of what we could ask for, and what we could essentially demand from the applicant. So we'll go through, Aaron will go through a little more detail of the specifics of what is in the form and character development permits, what we were evaluating.
Thank you, and Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Worship. Just kind of leading off on one of Tracy's things last said about the height, and it's here you can see on this chart that the height is the 8.92, which is less than the 10.5 meter maximum, but that's actually for the tallest building where it has the biggest difference in slope. The lowest building is 6.6 meters, so there's a little bit of variation when you consider just the 2 stories. You're really looking at around that closer to that 6.6, but when you have it on slopes, it is a little different. So some of the considerations that we looked at while evaluating this proposal. So we kind of the main guiding principles are, of course, the form and character guidelines of DPA 7. So that's where we're looking at the site planning and building siting, the building form and character, the building materials, the adjacency uses and how they're compatible, and some sustainability elements as well. So with the site planning, a lot of it was based off of kind of pre-existing, trying to make those align with the existing servicing, and having them kind of align also then with the kind of the settlement patterns of the existing strata and the surrounding properties. As Tracy mentioned, it is quite a challenging site to work with, both as kind of a whole site when you had it in conjunction with the old strata, but even more challenging when you look at separating the two stratas, since now it's gone from just triangle to a very odd shape. The development is built upon the natural grade, as the applicant did discuss earlier. A lot of that fill that was deposited from the first phase will have to actually be removed to accommodate this development. Here you can see the how they sit on the grade. So the top would be looking from a court road. Then you can see how they step down. The bottom image is showing it along Jasper, and you can see how the buildings align with the existing strata, which would appear on the left there. So when looking at the form and character, we're looking a lot at the integration with the existing buildings, how we're going to mitigate the bulk and massing through the design, the building articulation, the avoiding the large blank walls or uninteresting architecture. And so some of the interesting things about this is the buildings are sunk into the ground. They have the split level parking where on the rear of the building they enter in at grade, and then there's the 2 floors towards the front for both the units. The roof pitch and the design of the roof is very consistent with the surrounding neighborhood, especially the strata. It's mostly just almost a kind of updated look of those existing buildings. And so here you can see a lot of those kind of form character aspects. Quite pitch roof, not unlike a single family in form, just at a kind of larger scale to accommodate 4 units. Building materials, a lot of what we look like is the compatibility and the quality of the building materials. In C-Shop, we like high quality building materials. We try to avoid vinyl and various other things like that. Based off of the feedback we received from the Advisory Planning Commission, the applicant did revise their building materials to provide some variation, mostly in the color. But it still does reflect a lot of the surrounding context. Doesn't create a stark contrast to the surrounding uses. So here you can see a palette, a material palette. So you can see all the various colors and materials they're proposing to use. Relationship to adjacent uses. The orientation, kind of as I mentioned with the site planning, it's very similar to the existing strata. They're aligned together, so that will create a kind of uniform streetscape along Jasper Road. They have the similar kind of faces along Court Road, being kind of just staggered backwards. The heights are very similar to some of the surrounding buildings. I have some pictures later on that show some of the neighborhood context. A lot of the neighborhood is between the 1 to 2 story, mostly 2 story, and then a few 3 story buildings in the surrounding neighborhood. And kind of as talked as well, the massing is very similar, just kind of scaled up to match essentially the higher density use on the site. You can see some of the surrounding buildings. I believe this is just right across the street on Jasper Road. We are looking at the orientation of the street, the height and roof configuration, the massing and building articulation. So here you can see kind of right beside each other the existing strata on the left and the proposed building on the right. You can see that their shape, their massing is very similar. And you can really see that really it's just more of an update to the existing design rather than a completely different design. A lot of the same characteristics are shared between them. Again, similar picture, kind of looking at the separation between them. Landscaping. So a lot of the landscaping that they're proposing is keeping with the surrounding and adjacent context. There's some good landscaping along the front, much more intense landscaping along the kind of rear and side property lines to kind of help screen it from the use. They're proposing to do a 1.8 meter high solid cedar fence which would help to block any lights from traffic going on the internal road network, as well as provide some sound attenuation. So here are some of the kind of site characteristics. So this is looking down Jasper. You can see, so this is looking east down Jasper. And you can see those buildings. A lot of them kind of also similar. They 2 stories, maybe split level in the rear. And yeah, so you can see that. Then Piccadilly Park in the kind of far left, the back right. So outdoor space, this has kind of been an area of concern. We have worked hard with the applicant to address this. And a lot of it comes down to when we reduce the height of the building, we increase the amount of coverage to kind of achieve the same thing. So, so when the applicant was looking at 3 stories, there was a lot more lot coverage. When the applicant heard back from the community that 3 stories wasn't something they were willing to support and looked at doing 2 stories, that lot coverage increased to have the same density in the same area. This has caused, a reduced amount of green space. It reduced the amount of availability for parking, for excess parking, and it also then was combined with some of the extra factors like having the additional roadways needed as part of separating from the existing strata. And here you can see that open space and everything. Kind of the only the main area of open space is kind of up here in this triangle, but it is kind of the limiting factor here. So kind of in summary, the staff are recommending approval of the development permit as it is consistent with the OCP and zoning provisions. It meets the form and character guidelines, has compatible design material, and provides for that appropriate housing mix within the neighborhood. And then the recommendations, of course, are that the development permit be approved, subject to the attached plans that are attached to your report. That all the on-site exterior lighting is downcast and energy efficient, and that we receive a landscaping bond for the amount of the landscaping which would be held for 2 years to ensure plant survival. And then the last recommendation is that prior to the issuance of the development permit, that an easement be registered on the affected titles of both this property and the neighboring strata to ensure that they have access to those shared services that the applicant had mentioned earlier, such as I think water and storm and sanitary. So, is there any questions?
Let's see. I have 1 or 2, but I'll see if council would like to speak first. We're almost getting to this. Councillor Inkster.
Thank you. Just some clarifications, because I heard it was alluded to earlier that there was 1 parking spot per unit, but I'm detecting that there's 2 based on the math that I did. So correct. I don't know where the 1 came from, but there's 2.
Yeah. So there are 1 parking spot indoors in the garage and 1 outdoors for each. And so it's 2 parking stalls per unit, and that meets the zoning bylaws requirements.
Okay. Clarification. Thanks for now. Thanks.
If we're on parking, that was one of my questions. 1 inside, most people in North America use their enclosed garage for storage, and their car is outside. And I live right beside a development where the developer promised repeatedly in this room that there would be no on-street parking, and of course that's not the case. So we know what the reality will be. There will be on-street parking. I was actually interested in, I was on the site last night, and so I know the surrounding area. I know the existing massing of the current phase 1, but I was interested in the parking that's going to be along the rear back that is apparently creeping into what was called a setback. So I didn't really understand what the setback was, because it's not an easement and it's not a building setback. And if in your experience, parking is a benign use, and that's normal or not, or how it is. And I'm just asking, a lot of places I see the parking is in fact right on the lot line if you go to Vancouver or wherever, but I didn't know what your experience was. And certainly that was one of the concerns. So you could speak to the parking, especially the outside external parking, and how it's related or not related to what's called a setback area.
So kind of based off of what's been allowed throughout the district is we do allow parking and setbacks. The setbacks are mainly for buildings, primarily for buildings, driveways, of course, have to cross setbacks. Parking stalls are quite commonly in setbacks. So it is just kind of the common practice here.
Okay. And I think in other places, I think every condominium I've seen in Victoria has the parking is along one of the lot lines. Councillor Seegers, and then I'll come back to some things I have.
Thank you. Could you put up the slide again that shows the development data?
The comparison between the
Yes.
proposals.
That one right there, thank you. So if I look at the options that you've put down for us in number 3, you're saying the only way we could refuse this development permit application is if we cited development permit guidelines with which the proposal does not conform to. So legally, if it does not conform, we can refuse it at that point. Otherwise, if it falls within the guidelines that we have already established for zoning and for OCP, unless we are looking at addressing form and character, we have no way to actually refuse this proposal.
Through the chair, that's correct. You have a lot of scope within the guidelines to judge whether they met them or not. Was that sufficient or not? But where it falls within zoning, which is usually those essentially the volume and intensity of development and the use and the parking number, there wouldn't be flexibility on that. You can always refuse a development permit, but it really does need to be within that box, within those guidelines. And if it is a refusal, it needs to be reasons stated as to what council believes they are not meeting.
Okay, so what you've shown us here is they're actually below the zoning provisions for height, below the zoning provisions for lot coverage. The units, the parking, and the side yards are all as per required.
Correct.
So we could not reduce the number of units and all of those kinds of things because they're within our actual guidelines.
Correct.
So the community association has requested that we reduce that, and we can't legally.
Through the chair, you couldn't through a development permit process. Right. Council is empowered to do rezonings, but there's a whole nother set of criteria around that, and the courts do not look favorably when it's seen as being punitive or vexatious. So site-specific down zones are challenging. If we were to do, if there's an existing one somewhere else where something's not fitting, there is scope to look at that, but it needs to be done in a strategic way and a fair way.
Okay, thank you very much.
And Councillor Inkster.
So, I had some other questions, but in reference to that last set of questioning, because I've wondered this over the last number of days in reference to this development, what was permissible under our powers. And I guess what the issue is with this particular development is the development, its density, height, massing, etc., was proposed, as I've been told, in 1995, which puts some more units in... That's my kid.
That was your son, actually.
That was my kid. Yeah. I guess I need to talk to him. It wasn't that funny. But I
think he's on the side of the West Sechelt Community Association. Okay.
No, he knows what happens in the neighborhood. I guess that's the issue with this, is that when we look clearly at planning in those areas, it's single-family development, single-family homes, which is not what this is in reference to. So I guess that's the unfortunate part, because it was done before my time in that area, and there may be some constraints, but I would ask about legal permissibility and at that point in order to sort of reach a point at which we could have, if possible, a community and development congruity between what the community would expect and what the developer is planning and wanting to put on that property. Thanks.
And it has been zoned for a long time. There's only two of us that were actually active in 1995. One was on council and one was outside council working with community associations, but none of us can remember why it was an R4 in the middle of West Sechelt. So, Councillor Shanks?
Yeah, there's several issues that come up as I've heard all the presentations. And so I'm wondering perhaps if this was a comprehensive development area, what we'd be looking at in terms of remedying this situation, if it was in fact a comprehensive development area.
The chair, a comprehensive development is simply a different zone. I mean, again,
you make it whatever you want.
You're at a rezoning, so you can custom craft a comprehensive
You would have
development.
flexibility with regard to density, though.
While you're crafting it, once you've approved it, you do not. So, I mean, if you were starting fresh, you can use a CD zone to add whatever it is you feel you need to add to the zone. That's why the rule is in place, so you're not having to use a conventional zone if something is coming forward that has unique aspects or you want to guide something for a particular reason. That's the tool that lets you do that. It's not so relevant here in that no matter what approach you feel would need to be on there, it's pre-zoned. And so there's not a lot of remedies there now that it's been in place and been in place for a long time. You know, the benefit of hindsight, it was an R4 site from 95 on until an application in 2004. Certainly a lot of opportunities to change that at that time.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much for that. The surrounding area is residential 1. And I'm not sure how many single-family residences this piece of property would accommodate if, in fact, it was residential 1. But I'm thinking probably 6 or 8, maybe 10, somewhere in that range. So once again, the issue becomes protection, or whether or not you can protect views. And I've met with the West Sechelt Association, and the protection of views is not guaranteed, pure and simple. That having been said, that seemed to be one of the main concerns of the residences in the immediate area, if not just the West Sechelt Community Association. It certainly was by the residents in the immediate area. So to me, it's unfortunate that an acceptable plan, which was in phase 1, couldn't have received acceptance by this particular developer, simply on the basis of higher density, more dollars being created for the developer. So
let's keep it polite and quiet.
Having said that, we are in a catch-22 now that the explanation has been given to us by our planner in terms of the issues the only issues we can address are that of form and character. So it's going to be a difficult vote for a few of us here, but we'll do it.
Thank you, and I see Councillor Wright and Councillor Seegers. I'm not sure which was first. Councillor Seegers was first, and then I have a question about form and character.
Are duplexes conforming with our R4 zoning?
The definition of multifamily is 3 units or more. At the time that this was done, and looking back at the previous staff reports, I mean, duplexes are not a listed use in R4. There was an interesting interpretation that was proposed and that was accepted. So they were deemed to be compliant. It is unfortunate at that time that if that was the desire to do a duplex development that would have been satisfactory, that the zoning was not brought into alignment through the rest of that site. It could have been zoned to R4B that would have allowed that. It could have been taken down to R2. So, I mean, there were a lot of, at that time, a lot of remedies that could have altered that site. I'm not sure, and it certainly doesn't show up in the reports I was able to access as to what the thought process was behind that, but it remained an R4. So it does present some real challenges in that it would be asking staff to actually make them do a non-conforming use, which we cannot do.
Okay, thank you.
And Councillor Wright?
Well, thank you, Your Worship. Just so that it's very clear, if we start trying to alter the density of this particular development, we're very likely, we run the risk of potentially ending up in court. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And there is precedence on that.
And so our chances of success are not great because you have precedent cases already.
Through the chair, I'm not a lawyer, so don't take
No,
this
I
as legal
understand.
advice. What the courts would look at would be what was the applicant proposing? What did they put forward? What would the test of reasonableness be? Mm-hmm. That's really what the court looks at. It does tend to give a council quite a bit of slack in terms of if they've adjusted something, because it's very clearly implementing your policies. So they will err on that side, that is it in conformity with your policy. So that's what they'll read through, not just the letter of the law of what that guideline says, but what were you intending on doing here? They'll look at your OCP designation, they'll look at the zoning bylaw, what were the provisions there, and then the development permit to see, was that an appropriate interpretation or not? So they do tend to give councils a fair bit of leeway on that, but they'll read into the decision kind of a layered approach on that to make sure that they understand the intent. But I'm sure they would look at the fact that this R4 it wasn't a spot zone done now, it was in place for a long period of time.
Well, thank you very much for your opinion. I guess the sad part of this is that the developer and the community association weren't able to get together and have that discussion and come up with something that was acceptable to both parties. And now we're sitting here with a development that the community association is unhappy with, but and we're going to be caught with, do we want to go to court? Thank you.
And Councillor Inkster?
Thanks. As I've indicated previously this evening, I share those thoughts that there's some need for congruity between the two groups. And in speaking to the earlier, and it is true that our staff member, although she has a great deal of experience, does not have the legal background necessarily, but she's looking at the precedents and the issues. My concern is when we look at the development data that was asked to be, by Councillor Seegers, to be put up, is that if in fact the courts, and this is just my concern of potential interpretation, is that they see in the reduction from the zone provision down to 64.9 and then zone provision 10.5 down to 8.92, they may see within their interpretation some flexibility on the part of the developer to have reduced what could have been a maximum build out. So there's where I'm stuck again, and where we would put the district in a difficult difficult legal position. Going forward in terms of form and character, and in the information presented to us, the building siting and the look of the building. My concern going forward, and as we can project forward, because we seem to be caught in this particular case, is the massing of the buildings and the size of the buildings on site. So if in fact we can make some changes and or encourage changes going forward, that's where I would encourage them to occur to meet some of the community's concerns. Thank you.
Only if you defeat the development today, and I think staff would want some real guidance on what you mean by massing and density. So back to form and character, one of the concerns that was raised was the external stairs. And just on that, sometimes we see external stairs in R1 and sometimes not, but could we get some sense from planning on whether they felt that was an appropriate articulation, or how far outside of our OCP that really takes this?
I'll do one and you can jump in. Through the chair. Just to clarify too, the intent and the way it's written in the DPA guidelines is that it states that all external stairwells should be enclosed. So it does allow stairwells, but I'm guessing that the intent behind that was to avoid those conditions. Usually when you get the 3 to 4 story walk-up apartments, where sometimes from a visual perspective, when they do those external staircases that get a very commercial look to them when they've done the staircases like that and the landing on front, I think the intent was probably to not do that. In the case of this particular development, when we looked at that, it was a desire not to have it enclosed because it would actually add to the bulk. So we felt from a massing point of view, to actually meet the letter of that standard, it would actually push the building out a little bit more. So we felt that enclosing it would not have been a good solution there.
Thank you. And any further comments or clarifications or discussions by council, and then we'll look for the vote. Councillor Shanks.
Let's kick at the can here. So what can you tell me is the main floor area or footprint of each of the units, approximately in square footage? Do we know that?
Yeah, compared to the other building.
Well, yeah, in comparison to the other building.
Existing.
The 8 of the 4 duplexes.
First phase.
First phase. You put it on your iPad, it gets bigger, right?
Page 220.
It's hard to say.
It's got combined footprints. Yeah, I've got 220. I can see it in small print, but I can't read it enough to read it out loud.
Which page, Your Worship?
220. It's got, there's a little box on the right-hand side of each one of the drawings that says combined footprint. Probably 364 square feet, 3,043.52 square feet combined footprint. That's for the 4 units. Oh, I couldn't tell you that. It's in.
Different number, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. We amended the agenda today, so it's out by 61 some odd pages. Sorry. This was in
27 of the new one?
No.
The statistics?
No, it's in the actual. It's in item 10.2, and in Aaron's report. And it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages in. There we are.
There we are. Page 230. It's got all the square footage.
And you're leading where with this question, Councillor Shanks?
Oh, just in terms of the massing in comparison to the face, quite But
How big are the
obviously,
units compared to the old units?
Yeah.
We're looking for,
yeah.
Much bigger are these ones than, they seem to be the same size as far as we can see,
Well, that's
the units.
There's just more of them on the same land.
right, yeah.
Mr. Thompson?
Yes, so they're a bit of a different design. Looking at the floor plan, so so for there's again some variations because there's actually two different building types. The first level, I believe, is about 3,600 square feet, and the second level is about 3,000 square feet. And then those are both divided into 2 units, so probably about
Yeah, that's on the screen behind you now, I think.
yes.
So, and that helps, Councillor Shanks?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, not a whole lot.
Okay. As we proceed then to look at this, I just, one little reference point in the back of my mind is that there's some research done a few years ago, probably 15 years ago now, that was looking at the housing values across North America in neighborhoods, and the strongest indicator of house prices and the height of, or the value of houses was the strength of community associations. So, you know, that's one of the things that keeps prices and values in neighborhoods high. Those neighborhoods with very strong community associations exerting this kind of pressure, and those with neighborhoods without it. However, this is also about affordability and density, and this is what infill density looks like in 2018 when people are actually talking seriously about having affordable housing. So, Council, are you ready to look at the question? Councillor Shanks?
I was just going to say, is it out of line to suggest that that meeting take place with the association and residents to try and resolve the impasse that we seem to have here, or is council willing to deal with it at this time?
Unless we can provide some direction on the development permit guidelines to both parties,
right,
having a meeting at this point seems moot. And I haven't heard anything tonight that's talked about development permit guidelines, the form and character, massing and those things. So correct me if I'm wrong, if staff can provide some help here.
Through the chair, so it's development permit area 7 in the OCP, and if you were going to direct it back, would just need to be very clear of what aspects of that you feel that they're not meeting that would need to be re-looked at or renegotiated.
Do you want that slide back? There's 4 items on development permit area. I think the 2 councillors at least would like to see that. Not that one. The one that actually sets out the issues you can look at in that one right there. Regulates site planning and building siting, building form and character. I don't think there's any room there. Unless you can, with the density that's allowed under the zoning, there's not much direction you can provide on siting, because you can build to the edge of the bylaw, which is quite different than what's going on. Similar with form, character, building, and adjacency and compatibility, I think it's going to be in keeping. Councillor Inkster?
I know you want to go to the vote very soon. We've had quite a bit of discussion. There's been some community concerns introduced, but I hope it's clear to the community, you know, based on the earlier plan, 1995, that in a lot of ways our hands are tied in moving forward. So thanks.
That was Mayor Earl Bassey. He's long gone. Let's move on to this, and I'm sorry I can't take communication from the floor at this point. It's a business meeting and council has to deal and direct with it. We can only take questions when we're finished our meeting. I'm sorry. Recommendations. Number 2, that the development permit 2016-39 be approved for lot 63, except phase 1. With the following conditions, the property would be developed in accordance with the plans, elevations, and information contained in Schedules A and B attached. All on-site exterior lighting must be downcast and energy efficient, and that there be a landscape bond in the amount of $95,829. And recommendation 3, that prior to issuance of the development permit 2016-39, that an easement for the sharing of access and services is registered on the affected titles of Lot 63, except firstly Phase 1, so that's for servicing. And I think one of the real disappointments here is that there could not have been an agreement with the original phase. That would have opened up an awful lot more space, but for whatever reasons, that wasn't possible. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, for moving. Councillor Lutz is seconding it. Any further discussion? Consternation? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. I'm sorry it's not the result many people were looking for. And I think, if you don't mind, I'd like a 3 or 4 minute break so I could let people leave if they want, and I can take a break myself. think he wanted us to turn it down? Do you think he wanted us to turn it down? So he could pick it up?
Oh, he's looking for another piece of land that's got kind of.
Oh, yeah, well,
screwed up
we should be as well.
Yeah,
We should look
that's
through the
what
zoning bylaw.
Andrew just said, we don't have time.
Okay. 30 seconds. $25 seconds. I know. 15-second warning. 10-second warning. Yeah. Thank you very much for that recess, and I'd like to call this meeting back to order after our minor adjournment, and thank you for the patience of the people in the audience, and thank you for the councillors for taking the time to be thoughtful and explore all avenues on that. Democracy sometimes does take a while, and if you'll be indulgent with me, my first meeting of the day started exactly 12 hours ago. So let's try and get through this one. 10.3, seasonal mobile vending application for Davis Bay. And we have a report from the Manager of Financial Services. Motion to receive the report. Thank you, Councillor Shanks and Councillor Seegers. All those in favor. And the Director of Corporate Financial Services will speak to the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. Earlier this evening, Council approved an amendment to the Parks, Lands, Road Temporary Rental Bylaw, which affects the mobile vending in the district. One of the provisions in the revised or the amendment was that seasonal mobile vending permits are limited to food and beverage services only, but other forms of mobile vending services applications may be accepted and permits granted upon council resolution. When we went to RFP for this, we did get one proposal from Half Moon Sea Kayaks to provide paddleboard and kayak rental mobile vending at Davis Bay. There is 2 sites at Davis Bay. There's a smaller site which we really don't think is suitable for a mobile vendor, simply because it would be difficult for a mobile truck to actually get into that location. So we felt a non-food vendor would be an appropriate use for this site. We did meet with the proponent, and he is proposing to put up a 10 by 10 pop-up canopy tent and paddleboard rack to allow for the rentals. And he has said that he will not park his truck in the parking lot at Davis Bay. So with that, we feel this is will fit well with the beach environment, provide a good amenity to the Davis Bay area for people on the beach. And we would support and recommend the council grant the issuance of a mobile vending permit to Half Moon Sea Kayaks.
Thank you very much. Could I have the motion or the recommendation on the floor for discussion or not? Or Councillor Inkster and Councillor Shank seconding on discussion of this recommendation. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. We have received a letter from another business in the area who is taking exception to this. So I guess I'd have to question, when the RFP was put out, was it clear that we were actually advertising for all types of uses, or was the intention or the RFP basically determined to be for food, as that's all we've ever done in the past? I guess I'm wondering, did the other businesses in the community recognize that this was something they could even apply for prior to us now giving it to somebody who applied otherwise?
Your Worship, when the RFP went out, it was under the old bylaw without this amendment. So in fact, non-food vendors would have been an acceptable use to any of the sites actually at that time. So certainly there was an expectation or understanding that anyone could have put an application.
There was an implied understanding that vendors was broadly interpreted, even though the experience had been only food. An implied understanding.
I guess I can't speak for the people that didn't put in an application, but certainly we didn't limit it to food. We simply said the opportunity for mobile vending is at these locations, and anyone who wanted to could submit an application.
Thank you. Any? Councillor Singh and Councillor Inkster?
Yeah, we also did hear from the other individual with concerns, but I think it was speaking to the competitive situation of another location. I wasn't clear in the letter in my memory that it was that they wanted to locate there as well, or didn't get an opportunity. So that just, in terms of clarity, that's what I think I read. So if I could be corrected, that's fine. That's just what I interpreted it as.
I think the letter of concern was that that's the same, the competitor is located within a kilometer, and that's the body of water that they generally work with and take clients to, and clients connect with because they're close by. So, but it is simply about markets and competition and things of that nature. Councillor Wright?
Well, thank you, Your Worship. I understand that this is there's a one vendor here. What would you do if you had several vendors that responded to your RFP? Do you have a plan and a process for evaluating multiple vendors when you only have the one site?
Based on the way the bylaw is written, it says we can only issue 4 permits total, and that essentially it would be up to council to make that determination. We'd bring the applications, look at them probably from a suitability, but really it would be a case of council making that determination as to which one they felt best fit the location and the need.
Next year, you'll have to deal with that. Or tonight.
And thank you, Your Worship, because that's where I'm going. I hope that before this time next year, we have a plan in place that will allow us then to be able to deal with multiple vendors who may do that. And we won't be sitting here trying to make that decision on our own, okay, and picking the right one.
And I'm not sure if you would know this, but I've always associated Half Moon Sea Kayaks with Half Moon Bay. Is that actually where they're normally located with tours and things? And they're in Porpoise Bay. Okay. So they probably also have a current business license. Thank you. Any further discussion? We have a motion on the floor, and it is that council approve the issuance of a seasonal mobile vendors permit for the 2018 operational season to Half Moon Sea Kayaks. Councillor Seegers.
Sorry, one more question. What would be the actual season? This is operational season. What time period are we looking at for this?
I believe it's a 4-month term is what they're looking for. Typically the season would go through to the end of the summer, but I guess they're just looking for 4 months. So it would be likely from May, June, July to the end of August, I guess.
Yeah, they may actually want to go into September because it's better beach time. So they might want June, July, August, September, but 257, June, July, and August. Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? One opposed, but that's carried. And moving on to 11.1, which is councillors' reports. And in keeping with the lateness of the hour, we'll try and be succinct, though I'm sure there's been much going on in the last 2 weeks. So if I can start on my left with Councillor Wright.
Gee, yeah, I'll be quick, Your Worship, but thank you. Attended the Planning and Development Committee meeting. We did some work on the CAO's review. I had a meeting with the Historical Society, but I'll leave that for Councillor Inkster to talk about. Attended the Day of Mourning on Saturday, and this is the first year that we've had a plaque in Sechelt, and it was a very special service, and it was well done. I guess I want to talk about today. So, like the mayor, I started off at McDonald's at 10 o'clock till noon hour, helping them with McHappy Days. And I'll let somebody else speak to that. And then I left there at noon and came here for a workshop on harassment at 12:30 and got out of here at 4:30 to go to the water meeting across at Seaside Center at 5 o'clock and got out of there about 6:45 to come to council meeting tonight. Having said that, I had a number of coffee dates with about 8 residents in the community. And that concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you, and Councillor Inkster. Councillor Seegers, I'm trying to get to the other end of the table. Thought I could do that real quick. I'm sorry, my apologies, and I'll slow down. Councillor Seegers, anything to report?
All right. Library board meeting. It was the last meeting that our current librarian was attending. I'll just mention quickly some of the other ones. Others have mentioned the CAO annual review, the day of mourning, McHappy Days this morning. It's always a fun time. And the Respectful Workplace Workshop. The BC Parks session just before this as well. I'm going to mention a couple of others. The Seashelt Reconciliation Movement, they're calling it. There were a number of us attending. I'm sure somebody else will speak on it. It was a very interesting, informative, and I think there was a lot of passion that was brought forward by all parties. And I was pleased to actually take part in that. The RCM SARS fundraiser as well last weekend. And then I want to thank Coast TV for interviewing me and another lady in our community who's with me on this project. It's Ria Qureshi, around the 100 Women Who Care in our upcoming meeting on May 28th. We're looking to get to 100 women. We have about 60 registered right now. And once we get to 100 women, then we're going to be giving $10,000 away every quarter to a registered charity. So if you know anybody out there who'd like to join us, it's a 1-hour meeting. Please join us. That's all I'm going to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Is the 100 women registered as a?
No.
Okay, so it's, yeah.
We don't keep any of the money. All the money flows right through to the charity. So the money, the checks or cash or whatever, goes directly to that charity. We're just an organization to funnel it.
Good. Thank you. And Councillor Lutz, anything to report?
Thank you. Yes, SCRD committee meetings. The reconciliation project at the Longhouse was, as Councillor Seegers said, very moving. It was almost 5 hours, and it was really something to witness. On Thursday, I attended with one of our staff members a community action team meeting around harm reduction and the hope to get a grant and something started here on the Sunshine Coast. So there'll be more meetings around that coming in the next few weeks. I sent the rest of council the PowerPoint so they can have a chance to look at that. On Saturday, the day of mourning, was an excellent ceremony. I need to thank the staff here, the Greens crew, not golfing, the parks and Public Works for putting it all together for the Sunshine Coast Labour Council. And that marker is there and will remain there for people to visit throughout the year. And I hope next year we get a larger turnout. The weather was kind of bad this year. I also attended the barbecue for the search and rescue at Cooper's Green, and that was very well attended. And it's been a busy couple of weeks. That's my report.
Thank you. And Councillor Shanks?
Your Worship, it's a busy time of year for me as I gear up for my other job for the next 5 or 6 months. In addition to that, took part in the CAO annual review. It was a good experience, and this afternoon, I guess, was an even better experience with respect to the Respectful Workshop that was put on by 2 individuals. Certainly very enlightening and what we have to do, watching our P's and Q's in today's society, in today's workplace. That's all I have to report, Your Worship.
Thank you for that report. And Councillor Inkster?
Thank you. It has been a busy couple of weeks, and I'm glad Councillor Wright reminded me of something we were both part of the other day. Just going backwards from this evening, quickly with the water issue that was at the Seaside Center and the large attendance and the fact that we're, I mean, the format of the exercise and the length of our busy day in the meeting tonight didn't allow a number of us to be there for very long. But I think we know that the end of May, they'll have indicated there'll be another consultation opportunity with the community. And I'm sure they'll need that after the full house and the information they probably weren't able to gather, and they still need to gather on an important park decision right up close and adjacent to Sechelt. Day of Mourning was a good event. I'm glad to see it in Sechelt. Good on Councillor Lutz for encouraging that to happen, and our Parks Public Works staff for making it look very beautiful in there, as many of us noticed for the presentation. And the plaque's permanent display, so all those can go there and do their own personal mournings about those that have been lost in the work area. The reconciliation event, as was indicated, was very well attended, and it was good to see. It's always good to see the Sunshine Coast wider community as part of those events in the Longhouse, and I've seen a number of people that were there, including some Sechelt members, and they were just so happy to see us, all the communities there, to represented and to share that moment, those series of moments with them. The meeting that occurred the other day, and I'll just say that I was at a number of the other things that were mentioned, so I'll just focus on the, Councillor Wright called it the Historical Society, and he threw me off because I thought that we were at the museum the other day in Gibson's, but I think he meant the Natural History Society upstairs, and we discussed the Sechelt Marsh, and we requested that the information from that meeting in the minutes and some recommendations and suggestions come first to Public Works for some discussion over the general issue. But what we think will happen through discussion, Councillor Wright and myself, during the meeting and after, is that there may be some minutes and or recommendations that move from that to finance. I think that we may, some of the discussion may have to include the community forest. It might. Just because of some things that we may need to do when it comes to the Sechelt Marsh and its continued preservation, working with the Volunteer Society. And those should come next month to Public Works. Thank you.
Thank you for all those reports. For my report, I would just mention one that Councillor Seegers had also mentioned was I had an opportunity to meet with the library board. And I think that over the next few months, we need to have a discussion in the community that will allow us to think through how best to support the library in its current challenges for resources and space. And perhaps if we have the right discussion, then whoever is elected in October will have a mandate to actually act on that going forward. But it's a discussion that we all have to have so we can discuss and think through the best way to support the library. I think primarily on a regional basis. It's not that the District of Sechelt isn't supporting the library, but its users come from all through the coast, so we have to find a way to deal with that. The reconciliation movement has been discussed, and I just want to touch on that again as something that will come back. A number of the councillors were there, and a number were called as witnesses, so that is a commitment really for them to say what went on, what they heard, and what they did. So you'll hear more of that as we move forward. And as mentioned, Councillor Lutz needs to be congratulated for her efforts in having a marker put in place for a day of mourning, which is for workers who were killed on the job. And that shouldn't happen, but it still happens quite frequently. And a number of the people who attended were family members who had lost fathers, brothers, sisters from workplace accidents. And we forget that that still happens, but it's not just in the fishing and the logging industry, it's in a lot of workplaces, so we have to watch for that. The SCRD board, which is where I started at 9:30 this morning, 11.2, we have 2 directors on the SCRD board, and I'll look to Councillor Wright to see if he has anything to report from the regional district.
Thank you, Worship. Not to prolong the meeting, but in addition to the meetings I've already mentioned, SCRD had an infrastructure committee meeting. Interesting meeting. There was 8 reports, all framed around water. If you want a list of those reports, I have the paperwork here, and you can look it up online. Attended the police commission meeting. That was the most interesting meeting of the day. Nobody from the RCMP showed up, and so we were all sitting there because we had another meeting an hour later, okay, so there wasn't any point in leaving. And that was the Transportation Advisory Committee, and then there was the hospital board meeting, then there was the Corporate and Administrative Services Committee meeting, and then there was a board meeting. And that pretty much, there wasn't anything really heavy on the board meeting. A lot of amendments to OCPs. They finalized their audit, and both at the hospital board and at the SCRT, and those are the major things that happened, and that completes my report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving to item 12, 12.1, council correspondence. A motion to receive the correspondence. Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Councillor Lutz. Any of those 4 items to discuss? Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. I'd like to address the number 4.
Yes.
The letter from Mayor Wayne Rowe with regards to a draft watershed management and governance for the Sunshine Coast. And I have to get to that page. There are some recommendations in there. It's basically that we go ahead, we move forward with setting up a governance body to look at water on a regional scale and outside of, but incorporating the municipalities, but also others like the Conservation Society, like residents in the community.
So there are 2 proposals on page 4 of his letter, and whatever page the agenda is now, but it's a few pages from the end.
Yes.
Wanting the SCRD to undertake the exploration of 2 initiatives, the development of an integrated regional watershed management approach and the examination of models for regional watershed governance. Would you like to move a motion that the District of Sechelt support that?
Yes, please.
And seconded by Councillor Inkster. Any discussion needed? All those in favor? That's carried, and that will be in support of the town of Gibsons. They'll be appreciative. And that's right under the title, what are we proposing, on page 4 of his letter or agenda. Pardon? Any further items? No emergency items? A motion to adjourn? Thank you. That's all in favor. Thank you for being patient. It's 20 to 10, but there was at least one good question that I know has been waiting, and then another, so we'll start at the back.